The iron curry comb made a rhythmic, rasping sound against the coarse hair of the horse's flank, a sound that Margaret Cole found more comforting than any music. The stable was a cathedral of shadows, and the sharp, familiar scent of damp straw, old leather, and the heavy, honest musk of a working animal. Barnaby the Great stood as still as a mountain carved from granite, his massive head lowered in a state of tranquil endurance. He was a Shire of immense proportions, a living engine of bone and sinew that had pulled the weight of the Cole family for a decade. Margaret worked with a scrupulous intensity, her movements metrical and sure. She did not merely groom him, she was performing an audit of his strength, feeling the hard curve of his ribs and the massive, feathered joints of his legs. To the gentry of the Atherton estate, he was an eyesore, a relic of the mud and the furrow. But to Margaret, Barnaby was the only honest ledger they possessed. Her father, Peter Cole, stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the pale, watery light of a Derbyshire dawn. He looked as though he were composed of the very dust that clung to the rafters, grey, fragile and fading. He had worn his grief like weather for 7 years, ever since the fever had taken Margaret's mother and the rising costs of grain had begun to hollow out their lives. He watched his daughter with a look of quiet apology, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the splintered wood of the gate. A sorrow wearing a man's coat, Margaret thought, her heart tightening. She did not stop her work. She leaned her weight into the brush, smoothing the thick winter coat that would soon be Barnaby's only protection against the biting winds of the high moors. "The Duke's men will be here by noon, Margaret," Peter said, his voice a dry rustle. "They say the signature is already on the documents, the enclosure papers. They mean to turn the lower meadows into a private park for the Atherton Thoroughbreds. We cannot keep a plough horse if we have no land to plough." Margaret paused, the metal comb resting against the horse's warm hide. She looked at the animal's eye, a large, dark and liquid orb that seemed to hold a centuries-old patience. She thought of the crisp, cold legal documents currently sitting on a mahogany desk in Atherton Hall, signed by the hand of Arthur Atherton, the Duke himself. Those papers were a sentence of silence for their hearth. They represented a world that valued the grace of a racing stallion over the grit of a tenant's labor. "Numbers do not lie, father," she replied, her voice low and even, "but men lie about them. The Duke believes our debt is an unbridgeable chasm. He believes we are a deficit to be erased from his books." She resumed her brushing, the stroke longer and more forceful. "But he has forgotten that a mountain does not move simply because a man in a silk coat orders it to do so. We are not leaving, not today, and not when the winter comes." The peace of the morning was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of carriage wheels on the gravel path outside. It was a sound of intrusion, a sound that did not belong to the mud and the mist. Margaret did not flinch, though she felt Barnaby shift his weight, his heavy hooves making a dull thud against the earthen floor. She set the comb aside and wiped her ink-stained fingers on her apron, her spine straightening with an internal geometry of resolve. She walked to the stable doors, her boots heavy and caked with the soil of the very land they were losing. Silas Thorne stood beside a polished curricle, his boots gleaming with a shine that was an insult to the working yard. He was a man of high-collared vanity and sycophantic ambition, the Duke's chosen instrument for the cleansing of the estate. He held a leather portfolio as though it were a shield, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated barn with a sneer that he did not bother to hide. He looked at Margaret's stained hem and her wind-burnt face, and then he looked at the massive horse, peering over her shoulder. "Miss Cole," Thorne began, his tone dripping with a false, oily propriety. "I trust your father is prepared. I have the final notice here. The enclosure papers are quite clear regarding the transition of the lower acreage. The Duke requires the land for his autumn trials. It is a matter of breeding, you understand. One cannot have livestock of this caliber, wandering where the purebreds are meant to run." He gestured vaguely toward Barnaby, his lip curling at the horse's thick bone and feathered legs. Margaret stepped forward, the smell of wet wool and horse sweat radiating from her like a challenge. She did not look at the papers. She looked directly into Thorne's pale, restless eyes. "The Blackwood Endurance is in 3 days, is it not, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice cutting through his condescension. "The 40-mile trial across the Devil's Chimney. The Duke has offered a prize of £50 for the winner, plus a full waiver of arrears for any tenant who completes the course within the time limit. Is that not the law of the estate? Thorn let out a short, barking laugh that sounded like breaking glass. The endurance is a race for the elite, Margaret. It is a test of pedigree and speed. The Duke himself is entering his finest stallion. You surely do not suggest that you on that stone of a beast would even reach the first marker before sunset. It is an endurance trial, not a slow crawl to the grave. The rules state that any horse of the district may enter, Margaret said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. It does not specify the weight of the bone or the length of the stride. It asks for a rider who can stay mounted until the dusk. I will enter, and I will have the receipt for my entry fee now. Mr. Thorn, my father's debt will be settled by the grit of the plow, since the Duke finds our currency so lacking. Thorn stared at her, his amusement fading into a cold, hard irritation. He looked at the massive, unmoving horse and then back at the woman with the iron-hard integrity in her gaze. He snapped the leather portfolio shut with a sharp, violent sound. She watched him go, her hand reaching back to find the solid, warm reality of Barnaby's muzzle. The silence that followed was heavy and expectant. The house, the stable, and the very trees seemed to be holding their breath. Margaret looked out toward the dark, jagged line of the Blackwood moors, where the fog was already beginning to coil like a predator. She knew the arithmetic of survival. She knew the cost of the path ahead. But as she leaned her forehead against the horse's damp skin, she felt a surge of cold, brilliant certainty. The world was about to learn what a stone could do when the fire of necessity was lit beneath it. The gravel of the Atherton drive did not merely crunch underfoot. It seemed to protest the intrusion of the plough horse's heavy, unhurried tread. Margaret sat firm atop Barnaby, her spine an iron rod against the morning mist that clung to the ancient oaks of the estate. The manor house loomed ahead, a sprawling mausoleum of grey stone and ancestral pride that seemed to be holding its breath as the local gentry gathered for the Blackwood Endurance. Around her, the air was thick with the scent of expensive bergamot, oiled leather, and the frantic, sweet-smelling sweat of thoroughbreds that had never known the honest weight of a plough. As a brittle sound, like glass breaking on a marble floor, as she turned to her companions and gestured with a lace-trimmed whip toward Margaret's mount. Margaret ignored the ripple of snickering that followed. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on the horses of the elite. She noticed the way the expensive animals danced on their frantic, spindly legs, their eyes rolling to show the whites as the mist swirled around their hocks. They were high-strung engines of speed, designed for the short, glorious burst of a sprint on level grass, not for the grueling shale and deceptive bogs of the high moors. Even in the mild morning air, she could see them shivering, their thin coats offering no protection against the dampness that had started to seep into the marrow of the day. Barnaby, by contrast, stood like a boulder in a rushing stream. He did not fret, nor did he waste a single calorie on the nervous displays of his peers. Margaret reached down to adjust the heavy iron harness, a reinforced tackle of thick, blackened leather and hand-forged iron buckles that her father had maintained with scrupulous care for 3 decades. It was a harness built for the slow, relentless extraction of roots from stubborn earth, and its weight was a comfort against her thigh. While the others carried saddles of fine calfskin that weighed no more than a few pounds, she carried the heavy architecture of survival. The gathering fell into a sudden, vacuum-like silence as the heavy oak doors of the manor swung open. Arthur Atherton, the estate's overlord, descended the stone steps with the measured, terrifying grace of a predator who owned the very air he breathed. He wore his authority as he wore his grief, like a weather system that had remained unchanged for 7 years. His grey eyes, the colour of a winter sky that has not yet decided whether to snow, swept over the assembly, settling on his own mount, a black stallion that seemed less an animal and more a living flame held together by muscle and sheer will. The Duke did not immediately look at Margaret's face. His attention was caught by the sheer, improbable mass of Barnaby. He walked toward her, his boots clicking with a rhythmic, unforgiving precision against the wet stone. As he drew near, the heat from his stallion reached her, a sharp contrast to the cool, damp stillness of the Shire. Atherton stopped beside Barnaby's front shoulder, his gaze dropping to the horse's hooves. Massive, feathered things as wide as dinner plates, and caked with the honest mud of the Cole farm. A shadow of a sneer touched the corner of his mouth, a look that suggested he found the presence of a workhorse at a gentleman's endurance trial to be a personal affront to the laws of pedigree. He reached out a gloved hand, not to stroke the horse, but to inspect the quality of the iron bit with a clinical, detached curiosity. The silence of the courtyard was absolute now, the other riders leaning forward in their saddles to witness the inevitable dismissal of the tenant farmer's daughter. "You have brought a stone to a race, Miss Cole," the Duke said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried easily through the damp morning air. "It is a sturdy creature, no doubt, but the Blackwood moors are not a fallow field. They are a trial of spirit and speed. I would suggest you take the service road back to your father's gate before the first mile is through. It would be a pity to see such a substantial beast collapse before the sun is truly up." Margaret did not flinch, nor did she look away from those cool grey eyes. She felt the weight of the debt her father owed this man, a ledger of numbers that did not care for the history of their labour on his land. She gripped the reins. The coarse hair of Barnaby's mane a tactile reminder of the grit that lived in the bones of her family. "He is not a stone, Your Grace," she replied, her voice even and devoid of the tremors that Beatrice Vane clearly expected. "He is a constitution. Speed is a luxury of the morning, but endurance, that is the currency of the dusk. We shall see what remains when the light fails." The Duke's eyebrows rose, a minute movement that signaled a flicker of intellectual friction. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, seeing for the first time the ink-stained fingers that gripped the reins and the straight, unyielding line of her shoulders. For a heartbeat, the house seemed to hold its breath, caught between his arrogance and her quiet, iron-hard integrity. Then he turned away with a sharp, dismissive gesture to his master of the hunt. "Very well," he murmured, his back already turned as he moved toward his stallion. "Do not be surprised when you sink, Miss Cole. Thoroughbreds are bred for the heights. Stones are bred for the bottom of the river." Margaret watched him mount his living flame in one fluid motion, the stallion rearing slightly as if eager to leave the earth behind. She did not answer. She simply settled her weight more firmly into the heavy saddle, feeling the metronomic, slow-beating heart of Barnaby beneath her. The race was not yet a mile old, and already the air was changing, the first scent of coming sleet riding on the wind from the north. The elite riders began to move toward the starting line, a blur of hot color and nervous energy that left her behind in a cloud of fine gravel. Margaret waited until the last of them had passed, until the smell of their expensive perfumes had faded, leaving only the scent of damp fleece and the iron-rich mud of the drive. She urged Barnaby forward with a gentle press of her heels, the sturdy leather tack groaning softly in the stillness of the estate. The morning belonged to the Duke and his flames, but the dusk was a country she knew by heart. The morning air at the Atherton estate was the color of a bruised plum, thick with the scent of damp slate and the nervous energy of 40 high-strung thoroughbreds. Arthur Atherton sat atop his stallion, a creature of such exquisite, fragile architecture that it seemed composed of nothing but silk and fire. The horse danced on legs no thicker than a man's wrist, its nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of the commoners gathered at the edge of the paddock. The Duke adjusted his seat with a practiced, arrogant grace, his grey eyes, the cool, unyielding grey of a sky before a winter storm, sweeping over the assembly of riders. He looked through most of them as if they were merely part of the architecture of the yard, but his gaze snagged, inevitably, on the massive, unmoving form of Barnaby. Beside the Duke, Lady Beatrice Vane reined in her own mare, a delicate bay that looked more like a decorative ornament than a beast of burden. Beatrice adjusted her velvet riding habit, her lip curling in a silent, practiced sneer as she followed Arthur's line of sight. The contrast was almost comical. Where the other horses were twitching veins and restless motion, Barnaby stood like a mountain of honest meat, his thick legs rooted into the gravel of the yard. He did not toss his head, he did not foam at the bit, he simply breathed, a slow, rhythmic bellows that seemed to mock the frantic panting of the thoroughbreds. Arthur Atherton leaned forward in his saddle, reaching into the breast of his coat to produce a gilded flask. The silver of the Atherton crest caught the pale light, flashing with a cold, metallic brilliance as he unscrewed the cap. He took a long, leisurely swallow, the scent of expensive brandy momentarily cutting through the smell of horse sweat and mud. Then he began to laugh. It was a rich, melodic sound, but it carried the sharp, jagged edges of someone who had never known the indignity of being ignored. "You have brought a stone to a race, Miss Cole," the Duke said, his voice carrying easily across the hushed paddock. He gestured with the flask toward Barnaby's massive, feathered hooves. He was mocking her, but there was a strange clinical detachment in his tone, as if he were merely pointing out a mathematical error. "Do not be surprised when you sink. This is a trial of endurance, not a contest of how much mud one can displace. This creature is a statue with a pulse. It belongs in a furrow, pulling a plow through heavy clay, not on the high moors of Blackwood." Margaret Cole did not look up from her task. She was adjusting the stirrup leather, her ink-stained fingers moving with scrupulous precision against the worn brown hide. She felt the weight of his gaze like a physical heat against the back of her neck. But she refused to give him the satisfaction of a flinch. She had spent 20 years learning the language of silence, the kind of silence that had teeth. She knew that the Duke saw only the exterior, the plain wool of her dress, the lack of a pedigree, and the massive, ungraceful frame of the horse she had raised from a foal. He saw a liability, she saw a foundation. Lady Beatrice let out a tinkling, crystalline laugh that grated against the stillness of the morning. "Perhaps the girl is confused, Arthur. She may think the Blackwood Endurance is a parade for the village livestock. Look at the bone on that animal. It is positively industrial. It would take a week for a creature of that mass to find its stride, and by then we shall all be back at the lodge, drinking to our victory." The Duke chuckled, the amber liquid in his flask sloshing as he tilted it back once more. He looked down at Margaret, his expression softening into a mask of mocking pity. "If you have any sense of propriety, Miss Cole, you will take the flat service road. It is longer, yes, but it will spare your beast the humiliation of collapsing before the first ascent. Save yourself the embarrassment of being found by the search parties at midnight." Margaret finally turned her head, her gaze meeting the Duke's for a fleeting, dangerous second. Her eyes were not grey like his. They were the colour of the earth after a heavy rain, dark, steady, and full of a quiet, unshakable integrity. "I am not looking for a parade, Your Grace," she said, her voice even and devoid of the tremors he clearly expected. "And Barnaby is not a statue. He is the only thing in this yard that is not afraid of the wind." Arthur Atherton's smile did not falter, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of curiosity, quickly suppressed by a 7-year-old habit of disdain. "We shall see," he replied, his tone clipped. "We shall see what remains of that confidence when the moors begin to bite." He turned his horse with a sharp tug on the reins, the thoroughbred rearing slightly in a display of expensive, useless energy. Margaret watched him ride toward the starting line, the gilded flask glinting one last time before it disappeared into his coat. She did not feel anger. Anger was a luxury for those who did not have to worry about the cost of grain. She felt only the cold, hard weight of necessity. She retreated to the edge of the paddock, where the shadows of the old stone stables offered a moment of sanctuary. Her father, Peter Cole, was waiting there, his shoulders hunched against the biting chill of the morning. He looked older than he had a month ago, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by the spectre of the enclosure papers that sat on the Duke's mahogany desk. He did not speak. Silence was the one thing the Coles possessed in abundance. But he reached out and placed a hand on Barnaby's flank. The horse leaned into the touch, a low nicker vibrating deep in his chest. Peter held a rag in his calloused hand, stained with a mixture of oil and soot. He reached down to the reinforced draft rig that Margaret had insisted on using instead of a lighter racing saddle. The iron was thick, reinforced with double-stitched leather that smelled of tallow and honest labor. It was gear designed for a pull, not a sprint, for the slow, agonizing extraction of weight from the earth. With a slow, deliberate motion, Peter wiped a smudge of dark grease off the central iron buckle. It was a silent acknowledgement, a father's blessing given in the only currency they had left, the scrupulous care of their tools. Margaret watched the rag move over the metal, the rhythmic friction a comfort against the rising clamor of the thoroughbreds nearby. Her father looked up, his eyes weary but searching. "It is a long way to the chimney, Meg," he whispered, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "I know, father," she replied, her voice low. But Barnaby does not know how to quit. He only knows how to move forward. She checked the buckles one last time, her fingers tracing the cold geometry of the iron. This was her ledger, her arithmetic of survival. Every ounce of weight, every stitch in the harness, had been calculated to withstand a pressure the Duke's silk-clad world could not even imagine. The house, the land, and the very breath in her father's lungs were all tied to the strength of this iron. As the first signal horn sounded in the distance, Margaret felt the world begin to narrow until there was nothing left but the horse, the road, and the relentless, metronomic beat of a heart that did not know it was supposed to fail. The Atherton estate was holding its breath, and for the first time in 7 years, Margaret Cole was the only one who knew exactly how to exhale. The registration hall of the Atherton estate was a cavernous space of cold marble and echoing silence. The kind of silence that usually preceded a verdict or a funeral. It was a room designed for the rustle of banknotes and the smooth, effortless signatures of men who had never known the grit of limestone under their fingernails. When Margaret Cole stepped across the threshold, her stout leather boots left a trail of damp soil on the pristine floor. She felt the weight of the room before she felt the eyes upon her. The air smelled of expensive beeswax and the sharp, metallic tang of the ink used to draft the enclosure papers. The very documents currently resting in a leather portfolio on the mahogany desk, waiting to devour her father's life. Silas Thorne sat behind the registration ledger, his posture as rigid as a tombstone. He was a man composed of sharp angles and shallow vanities, his cravat tied with a precision that suggested he spent more time before a mirror than a plow. As Margaret approached, Thorne did not look up immediately. He allowed the nib of his pen to scratch across the heavy cream paper with agonizing slowness, a deliberate display of status through the weaponization of time. Beside him sat Lady Beatrice Vane, who was delicately fanning herself despite the autumn chill. Her gaze raked over Margaret's wool cloak, worn thin at the elbows and smelling of wood smoke, with a clinical, detached sort of disgust. "I am here to register for the Blackwood Endurance," Margaret said, her voice a low, steady chime that did not waver. She did not ask, she stated. Thorne finally lifted his head, his thin lips curling into a smile that resembled a tear in a piece of silk. "Miss Cole, I believe there has been a misunderstanding of the, shall we say, prerequisites? This is a trial of breeding and constitution. It is not a Sunday trot for the local tenantry." He glanced past her toward the courtyard where Barnaby stood, a massive, unmoving shadow in the grey morning light. "The entrance fee alone is more than your father's harvest has yielded in 3 seasons. Instead of answering, Margaret reached into the deep pocket of her cloak. She withdrew a small knotted canvas bag and placed it on the desk. The sound it made was not the soft thud of paper, but the heavy, dull clink of metal. She untied the twine with fingers that were calloused but scrupulously clean. One by one, she began to lay the coins out on the registration ledger. They were small, tarnished copper and silver pieces, shillings and pence that bore the marks of years of hoarding. Many were stained with the dark, iron-rich soil of the coal farm, as if the land itself were paying its own ransom. The clerk hesitated, his hand hovering over the coins as if they were live coals. Margaret watched him, her spine as straight as a ledger line. "Every penny is accounted for, Mr. Thorne. I am a woman of scrupulous arithmetic. You will find that the debt of entry is paid in full." Thorne's face flushed a mottled purple. The physical reality of the coins, dirt and sweat turned into currency, seemed to offend the very air he breathed. He looked at Beatrice, seeking an ally in his mockery, but Margaret's gaze remained fixed on him, a silent, iron-hard challenge. The registration was a contract, and Margaret Cole understood contracts better than most men of rank. She knew that numbers did not lie, even when the people who counted them did. The night before the race descended upon the Atherton estate like a bruised purple curtain, bringing with it a biting wind that smelled of wet slate and impending ice. Arthur Atherton stood on the stone balcony of the West Wing, a shadow among shadows. He had worn his grief-like weather for 7 years, and tonight the storm felt particularly close. He held his gilded flask in a gloved hand, the silver engraved with the Atherton crest cold against his palm. Below him, in the lantern-lit yard, the high-strung thoroughbreds of the other competitors were creating a cacophony of nervous energy, hooves drumming against stable doors, frantic whinnies cutting through the dark. Then he saw her. Margaret was in the open yard, far from the warmth of the main stables. She was kneeling beside a massive, bucket-shaped horse that looked more like a prehistoric monument than a racer. There was no silk here, no grooms, no fanfare. The Duke watched, his grey eyes narrowed, as she prepared a simple mash of oats and molasses. She moved with a metronomic grace, her actions devoid of the frantic vanity that characterized the other riders. He noticed, with a sudden sharp pang of curiosity, that her horse, that stone of a beast. Barnaby did not flinch when a sudden gust of wind rattled the heavy iron gates of the yard, while his own prize stallion, a creature of fire and nerves, was currently being sedated by 3 grooms. In the south barn, this plow horse stood like a boulder in a stream. It did not startle. It did not waste an ounce of energy on fear. The Duke took a slow pull from his flask, the brandy burning a path down his throat, yet failing to thaw the ice in his chest. He observed the way Margaret spoke to the horse, not with commands, but with a quiet humming tone that seemed to ground the very air around them. She was feeding the animal from her own hand, her fingers disappearing into the thick velvet muzzle of the beast. In the flickering light, her face possessed a stark, intellectual beauty, a clarity of purpose that made the painted ladies of the London season seem like pale, flickering ghosts. "A sorrow wearing a man's coat," he whispered to the knight, the phrase tasting of salt and old regret. He had spent years surrounding himself with the fastest, the most expensive, the most fragile things, believing that speed could outrun the ghost of his past. Yet, here, in the mud of his own yard, was a woman who seemed to understand that endurance was not about the sprint, but about what remained when the sun went down. He watched her finish the feeding and lean her forehead against the horse's massive neck for a single unobserved second. The house was holding its breath, the silence between them having teeth that nipped at his composure. He found himself resenting her, not for her poverty, but for her stillness. He was the Duke of Atherton, master of 10,000 acres, yet he felt like a pauper in the face of her quiet, iron-clad integrity. She was preparing for a war, and he was merely preparing for a race. As she led the horse toward the shelter of a lean-to, the Duke tightened his grip on the balcony railing, his knuckles white against the cold stone. He did not know then that by the next sunset, his life would depend on the very beast he had so publicly mocked. The morning air at the Atherton starting line was a volatile soup of mist and equine adrenaline. It was a scene of curated chaos, where the elite of the county gathered to display their fortunes on 4 legs. Arthur Atherton, the Duke, sat astride his stallion with a predatory grace. A gentleman who had worn his grief like weather for 7 years, now finding temporary shelter in the demands of a high-strung beast. Around him the air was thick with the scent of expensive pomade and the nervous, metallic tang of thoroughbred sweat. These animals were creatures of silk and electricity, their skin so thin that one could see the maps of their frantic veins pulsing beneath the surface. They danced, they lunged, and they fought the bits that sought to contain their explosive energy. And then there was Margaret Cole. She sat atop Barnaby the Great, and the contrast was so sharp it felt like a physical blow to the sensibilities of the watching crowd. Barnaby stood precisely where she had placed him, a boulder in a stream of hysterical motion. He did not fret. He did not toss his massive head. He simply occupied space with a terrifying, heavy finality. Margaret felt the weight of the unyielding draft rig beneath her hands, a construction of thick, scrupulous leather and unpolished metal that spoke of labor, not leisure. It did not shine like the silver-embossed tackle of the Duke, but it was honest. Every buckle was reinforced, every strap designed for the agonizing pull of a laden wagon through winter wheat. It was the architecture of survival, not the decoration of a race. Arthur looked at her from the height of his pedigree, his grey eyes, the color of a sky that has not decided whether to clear, narrowing in a mixture of pity and amusement. The Duke's stallion, a living flame of a creature, sidestepped and reared, its hooves striking the turf with a frantic, hollow rhythm. The man seemed to enjoy the struggle, his gloved hands masterfully curbing the animal's desire to bolt. He was a sorrow wearing a man's coat, and today that sorrow sought the distraction of speed. "Miss Cole," Arthur said, his voice a cool blade that sliced through the cacophony of whinnies and the chatter of the gentry. "Is your creature quite well? He appears to have succumbed to a profound lethargy before the signal has even dropped. Perhaps he believes we are here to till the Duke's south meadow, rather than traverse the moors. Indeed, Barnaby had closed his eyes. His massive feathered ears flickered once, dismissively, at a frantic thoroughbred nearby, but otherwise he remained motionless. To the onlookers, it was the height of indolence. To Margaret, it was the cold-blooded wisdom of a beast that knew the difference between a sprint and a siege. Barnaby was not lazy, he was a ledger, carefully balancing his accounts of energy, refusing to spend a single heartbeat on the vanity of the crowd. He was a mountain of honest meat, and mountains did not tremble at the sound of a horn. "He is conserving himself, Your Grace," Margaret replied, her spine as straight as a garden stake. "The moors are an unforgiving creditor. It is best not to be overdrawn in the first mile. Barnaby understands the mathematics of the earth better than most men understand their own souls." The Duke laughed, a sharp, rattling sound like breaking glass. "A stone to a race, Miss Cole. As I warned you, do not be surprised when you sink beneath the surface while we are flying above the mire." He turned his mount, the gilded flask at his hip, catching a stray beam of sunlight with a mocking glint, and signaled to the master of the course. The signal dropped with the finality of a guillotine blade. In a heartbeat, the world became a blur of mud and thunder. The thoroughbreds exploded forward, a living wave of speed and desperation, their hooves tearing at the turf as if they intended to uproot the very foundations of the Atherton estate. The air was suddenly filled with the scent of kicked-up peat and the frantic cries of riders urging their mounts into a gallop. The Duke vanished into a cloud of dust almost instantly, his stallion's stride a terrifying display of power that Margaret knew could not be sustained. Margaret did not move. Not at first. She sat amidst the settling dust of the departed elite, feeling the vibration of the earth as the sound of the thunderous start began to fade into the distance. She waited until the frantic roar of the initial charge had softened into a distant, rhythmic rumble. Only then did she give Barnaby the gentlest nudge of her heels. He did not explode into motion. He leaned into the air, his massive shoulders shifting with the power of a tidal wave. He settled into a steady, metronomic trot. 1, 2, 3, 4. Margaret began to count the beats in the silence of her mind, treating the distance as a problem of arithmetic rather than glory. Every strike of Barnaby's heavy hooves was a promise made to the land. She ignored the jeers of the few spectators who lingered at the starting line, those who pointed at her heavy horse and laughed at the slow, deliberate pace. They saw a plow horse being left behind. Margaret saw a survivor beginning a journey that the others had already forgotten was a test of endurance, not a display of agility. As the Atherton manor house shrank behind her, Margaret looked toward the high moors. The horizon was rapidly starting to bruise with the first hints of the coming storm, the clouds gathering like creditors at a door. The elite riders were miles ahead now, fueled by the arrogance of their breeding and the belief that the world was a flat, manicured park. Margaret knew better. She knew the Blackwood moors were not a playground but a trap, a landscape of hidden bogs and treacherous shale. She counted the beats. The rhythm of the trot became her world, a steady, unbreaking pulse that felt like the breathing of the earth itself. The smell of wet wool and iron-rich mud rose from the trail, and she adjusted her grip on the reins. She was not racing the Duke. She was racing the twilight. While the thoroughbreds were busy burning their lightning in the first few miles, Barnaby was banking his thunder. The race had only just begun, and the silence of the moors, it seemed, already had teeth. The 10-mile marker was a lonely post of weathered granite, half swallowed by the creeping gorse and the grey, indifferent mists of the high moors. Margaret Cole did not look at it for the sake of triumph. She looked at it as a bookkeeper looks at a ledger. It was a point of tally, a measurement of distance against the dwindling reserves of the day. The transition from the groomed bridle paths of the Atherton estate to the raw, uncurated terrain of the jagged highlands had been gradual, yet the shift in the air was absolute. The scent of lilacs and cut grass had been replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of soaked fabric and the iron-rich perfume of disturbed mud. It was a heavy smell, the scent of a landscape that had no interest in being beautiful for the sake of an audience. Barnaby the Great moved beneath her with the relentless metronomic cadence of a ticking clock. He did not possess the frantic, bone-jarring energy of the thoroughbreds that had vanished into the mist ahead. He possessed something far more terrifying to those who understood the physics of exhaustion. He possessed momentum. Every strike of his massive feather-fringed hooves sent a vibration through Margaret's spine that felt less like a gallop and more like the beating of the earth's own heart. She adjusted her seat, her fingers grazing the thick blackened leather. It was a sturdy, unlovely thing, reinforced with thick leather and buckles that were meant for the pull of the field rather than the vanity of the parade. It creaked in a rhythm she had known since childhood, a sound of safety, of work, and of things that did not break when the weather turned. The first drops of rain did not fall so much as they materialized out of the thickening air, coating Barnaby's chestnut hide in a fine silver sheen. Margaret pulled her cloak tighter, her scrupulous mind already calculating the shift in the footing. The shale paths ahead would soon become treacherous, turning into a slick slurry of stone and water. To the Duke, this was a race, a test of blood and fire. To Margaret, it was a problem of gravity and friction. She leaned forward, pressing her ink-stained hand against the horse's worn neck, feeling the immense, slow-burning engine of his muscles. The moor was beginning to wake, and it was not a kind awakening. The silence of the high peaks, she noted with a tightening in her chest, seemed to have teeth. It was a premonitory stillness, the sort of quiet that precedes a blow. Miles ahead, where the air was thinner and the vanity of the morning still lingered like a fading perfume, Arthur Atherton, the formidable landowner, reined in his stallion. The animal was a living flame, a creature of such exquisite breeding that it seemed to vibrate with its own internal heat. Beside him, Lady Beatrice Vane looked like a portrait in a gilded frame, her silk habit miraculously free of the grime that had claimed the lower trails. The Duke reached into the pocket of his tailored coat and withdrew the gilded flask. The silver surface caught the pale, dying light, the Atherton crest gleaming with a stubborn, aristocratic pride. He took a short, sharp sip of the brandy, feeling the warmth bloom in his chest, yet his grey eyes remained fixed on the horizon. Arthur was a man who understood the architecture of a horse better than he understood the architecture of his own grief. He noticed the minute tremor in his stallion's flank, a flicker of fatigue that should not have been present so early in the endurance trial. The Thoroughbred's breathing was too fast, too shallow, a ragged sound that grated against the Duke's sense of propriety. He looked back at the string of elite riders trailing behind them, their mounts already showing the telltale signs of the high-altitude chill. They were horses bred for the sprint of the London season, for the soft turf of the downs, not for the bruising, ancient indifference of the unforgiving highlands. A low, subterranean rumble moved through the ground, a vibration that had nothing to do with the thunder of hooves. Arthur felt it in the soles of his boots, a deep, resonant warning that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the mountain. He saw Lady Beatrice flinch, her delicate features pinched with a sudden, uncharacteristic uncertainty. The Duke did not speak. The silence between them was too heavy for small talk, weighted with the unspoken expectations of their class. He knew the signs of a moor storm. He had watched them gather for years, a weather of the soul that matched the storms of his own household. The sky was no longer the color of a bruise. It was the color of slate, cold and unforgiving. He thought, for a fleeting, inexplicable second, of the woman on the plow horse. He remembered the way she had stood at the starting line, her spine as straight as a ledger line, her eyes devoid of the sycophancy he had come to expect from the world. He had laughed at her, a sharp, brittle sound that had served as a shield for his own irritation. But as the first gust of wind tore across the ridge, carrying the scent of ozone and impending chaos, Arthur Atherton felt a strange, chilling realization. The environment was shifting. The rules of the sprint were being rewritten by the iron-hard logic of the storm. He tucked the gilded flask away, his calloused hands tightening on the reins. The flame of his stallion felt suddenly small against the gathering dark, a flickering light in a world that was rapidly turning to stone. The Duke looked at the Devil's Chimney pass in the distance, a narrow, jagged throat of rock that was the only way forward. The mist was no longer a veil, it was a wall. He could no longer see the riders behind him, and the silence that followed the thunder was not a peace, but a predatory waiting. He knew, with the instinct of a noble who had worn his grief like weather for 7 years, that the endurance trial had ceased to be a game of status. It had become a ledger of survival, and the ink had started to run red. The atmosphere over the Blackwood moors shifted with the suddenness of a closing door. One moment, the wind had been a distant, howling grievance. The next, the sky collapsed. It was not a rain that fell in droplets, but a solid, grey weight that seemed to seek the very marrow of the bone. Margaret Cole felt the temperature plunge with a violent shudder, the air turning from the damp chill of autumn to the biting iron of a premature winter. Before her, the pass known as the Devil's Chimney narrowed into a jagged throat of black slate and treacherous shale. A bottleneck that had claimed more than one shepherd in years past. The transformation of the earth was instantaneous. The dry, brittle shale beneath Barnaby's hooves became a viscous slurry, a river of dark mud that surged down the incline with a predatory roar. It was here that the architecture of the thoroughbred failed, their light-boned frames ill-equipped for the sudden liquefaction of the world. Margaret watched the narrow path ahead dissolve into a chaotic descent of sliding stone and rising water. Barnaby the Great did not panic, a creature born of the heavy clay and the deep furrow. He did not possess the frantic, nervous energy of Duke's prized racers. Instead, the massive horse lowered his head, his thick neck arching as he braced his shoulders against the descending torrent. The massive working tackle creaked, a sound of honest, unyielding metal, resisting the pull of the gravity that sought to drag them into the ravine. While a lighter horse would have been swept from its feet by the sheer volume of the mud, Barnaby's wide, feathered hooves acted as anchors. He found the solid granite beneath the silt, planting each limb with the deliberation of a master mason. Margaret felt the vibration of his strength through her knees. It was the rhythm of a living mountain, a force that did not fight the storm so much as it simply refused to be moved by it. The mass of his cold-blooded lineage was his salvation. He was too heavy to be buoyant, too steady to be terrified. He was, in every sense, the stone the Duke had mocked. As they ascended higher into the throat of the chimney, the wind began to carry the scent of sodden garments and the metallic tang of clashing slate. Margaret adjusted her weight, her spine held with a scrupulous rigidity that mirrored the horse's resolve. She did not use a whip or a spur. Such things were for men who did not trust their mounts. Instead, she spoke to him in a low, gravelly hum, a sound that bypassed the ear and went straight to the animal's heart. The slurry reached Barnaby's hocks, pulling at him with the strength of 1,000 hands, yet he leaned into the pressure. His breath was a metronomic blast of steam in the freezing air, a sign of a constitution that had been forged in the grueling labor of the harvest. He was a living mountain of honest meat, and in this crucible of mud and sleet, honesty was the only currency that remained solvent. Margaret glanced down at her own hands, the fingers stained with the black grease of the harness, and felt a grim satisfaction. The high-strung world of the elite was dissolving, but the plough horse was only just beginning to work. By the time they reached the high plateau beyond the chimney, the wreckage of the hunt became visible through the veil of sleet. It was a tableau of surrendered vanity. Margaret navigated Barnaby through a field of exhausted animals and broken spirits. Expensive thoroughbreds, their coats once glossy as polished mahogany, now stood shivering with a violence that shook their very frames. Their lungs, designed for the short, fiery sprint of the turf, were laboring in the thin, frozen air, their breath coming in white plumes that were instantly snatched away by the gale. Beside a cluster of stunted pines, she saw the unmistakable glint of ruined finery. Lady Beatrice Vane stood beside her mount, a creature of such delicate bone it looked as though it might shatter under the weight of the rain alone. Beatrice's silk jacket, a garment intended for the aesthetic pleasure of the starting line, was plastered to her skin, a sodden, useless rag that offered no protection against the meteorological onslaught. Her face was a mask of pale, aristocratic shock, her lips the color of a bruised lilac. As Margaret approached, the sound of Barnaby's steady, rhythmic hoofbeats seemed to slice through the howling wind like a blade. The massive plough horse loomed out of the grey light like a spectre of the soil, his thick coat matted with mud, but his eyes calm and unwavering. Lady Beatrice looked up, her gaze travelling from the horse's enormous, dirt-clogged hooves to Margaret's rain-streaked face. There was no mockery left in that look, only a profound and hollow confusion. It was the expression of a woman who had realized too late that the environment held no respect for a pedigree. The Moor did not recognize the vain name. It only recognized the density of the bone and the grit of the heart. Margaret did not slacken her pace, though the sight of the shivering horses tugged at her conscience. She knew the arithmetic of survival on these moors. To stop was to succumb to the cold. She saw Silas Thorne further down the slope, his boots ruined as he struggled to lead a limping stallion toward the lee of a rock. He did not even look up as she passed. His arrogance had been stripped away by the sleet, leaving behind nothing but the raw, shivering reality of a man out of his depth. The rugged equipment continued its rhythmic, metallic song, a steady clink, clink, clink that served as the only pulse in this frozen wasteland. Margaret's own cloak was heavy with water, the wool smelling of damp earth and old smoke, yet she felt a strange, cold heat rising within her. Being seen by the right person was not the danger. It was the only safety worth the name, yet here, under the bruising sky, she was seen by no one but the broken. The elite riders had become ghosts in their own race, their expensive equipment reduced to dead weight in the rising slurry. Margaret scanned the horizon, her eyes narrowed against the stinging sleet. Somewhere ahead, the Duke of Atherton was still fighting the storm. He had been leading the pack when the clouds first broke, his stallion a living flame of speed and ego. If the thoroughbreds of his companions had collapsed, Margaret knew the Duke would be pushing his own animal toward a catastrophic breaking point. The silence of the moor, it seemed, had teeth, and it was beginning to bite into the very foundations of the Atherton pride. She urged Barnaby forward, the horse's gait never wavering from that relentless, metronomic trot, as the light began to fail, and the purple shadows of dusk started to bleed into the grey. The sky over the high moors did not simply darken. It collapsed, a heavy canopy of slate and bruised violet that seemed to press the very breath from the lungs. The rain, which had been a nuisance of fine mist, suddenly sharpened into sleet. Needles of ice that flew horizontally, driven by a wind that had spent its morning gathering malice in the north. It was the kind of weather that was not merely a condition but a creditor, arriving with an iron hand to demand a payment of warmth that the elite horses of the lowlands could no longer afford. Margaret Cole felt the shift in the marrow of her bones, a cold that bypasses the skin and goes straight for the soul. But her focus remained anchored in the rhythmic, heavy strike of hooves against the rising mud. Barnaby did not falter. While the thoroughbreds she had passed earlier were beginning to show the ragged edges of their endurance, the great Shire seemed to have found a secondary, deeper gear of existence. His thick winter coat, a feature the Duke of Atherton had mocked as a sign of commonality and lack of breeding, had become his primary salvation. The coarse hair trapped his massive body heat, and as the sleet melted against his skin, a dense, white steam began to rise from his flanks. To anyone watching from the shadows of the crags, Margaret would have appeared as a phantom riding within a glowing cloud, a temple of warm breath and honest sweat, moving through a world of freezing death. The contrast between the silk and the iron horses became agonizingly visible as she navigated the turn toward the higher reaches of the treacherous gorge. She passed a grey stallion, an animal that had likely cost more than her father's entire farm, and the 3 generations of labor that had sustained it. The creature was no longer a living flame, as the Duke might have phrased it. It was a ghost. It stood with its head hanging low, its fine-boned legs shivering with such violence that the stirrups clattered against its ribs like a funeral bell. Its rider, a man in a sodden scarlet coat, was frantically rubbing the animal's neck, his face a mask of aristocratic terror. He did not even look up as Margaret passed. He was learning, far too late, that beauty is a fragile currency when the ledger is written in ice and shale. Margaret adjusted her grip on the reins, her fingers stiff within her wool-lined leather gloves, but she did not pull back. She could feel the tension in the massive strapping, that practical, reinforced assembly of leather and metal that anchored her to the plow in the spring and to her survival now. Each groan of the iron buckles was a testament to the fact that they were designed for the pull, for the long, agonizing extraction of life from the earth, rather than the fleeting vanity of a sprint. The harness was not elegant, but it was scrupulous. It did not lie about the weight it could bear. It was as she crested a ridge overlooking a treacherous, mud-slicked ravine that she saw the first true casualty of vanity. Silas Thorne had clearly attempted a desperate shortcut, a gambit of ego intended to reclaim the lead he had lost when the weather turned. His bay hunter was down, pinned in a hollow where a small stream had transformed into a surging, chocolate-colored torrent. The horse was not merely tired, it was broken. Its spirit surrendered to the cold. Thorne stood beside it, his expensive riding boots caked in filth, his voice a high, thin reed against the gale. "Miss Cole, stop! Over here! Damn you!" Thorne screamed, his arms flailing. The wind caught his words and shredded them, but the desperation was unmistakable. He was the individual who had hand-delivered the enclosure papers to her father's. Dorr, the clerk who had looked at their small, tidy barn and seen only a line of potential profit for the Duke's estate. Now, he looked like a drowned rat, stripped of the authority of his office and the protection of his master's name. Margaret pulled Barnaby to a momentary halt, the Shire's breath coming in deep, cavernous heaves that sounded like the earth itself was sighing. She looked down into the ravine, her mind performing a rapid, cold arithmetic. To descend into that hollow would cost Barnaby 10% of his remaining strength. To extract Thorne and his horse would cost another 30. They had yet to reach the apex of the high ridges, the highest and most exposed point of the endurance trial, where the wind would be at its most lethal. "My horse is spent. You must help me move him," Thorne yelled, his face turning a sickly, mottled blue from the sleet. Margaret looked at the massive shoulders of her plow horse, then back at the man who would take her father's roof. Her integrity was not a soft thing. It was iron-hard and forged in the necessity of survival. If she helped him now, she would fail the finish line. If she failed the finish line, she would lose the farm, and more than that, she knew the limits of her animal's constitution. Barnaby was a monument of honest muscle, but even monuments can be overtopped by a flood. "I cannot—" "Mr. Thorne," Margaret called back, her voice level stripped of both malice and pity. "The ground is too soft for a pull in that hollow. If I bring him down there, we all sink. You must abandon the horse and walk to the lower shelter. There is a shepherd's hut half a mile back." "You're leaving me?" Thorne's voice broke, a jagged sound of pure disbelief. "I'll have you evicted for this. I'll see your father in the poorhouse by morning." "You already intended to do that." "Sir," Margaret replied, her eyes as cold as the sleet that crusted her eyelashes. "Right now I am managing the only asset I have left. I suggest you begin walking before the light fails entirely." She gave a small nudge to Barnaby's sides. The Shire leaned into the collar, his massive hooves finding purchase in the shifting shale where the Thoroughbreds had slipped. Thorne's curses followed her for a few moments, a vitriol that was quickly swallowed by the roar of the rising storm. Margaret did not look back. She had a debt to pay, and a finish line that existed somewhere in the purple gloom ahead. A point where the grit of the plow would finally meet the judgment of the dusk. The sky above the Blackwood moors was no longer a canopy of air. It had become a descending ceiling of wet wool and grinding stones. At the precipice of the Devil's Chimney, the world seemed to contract into a narrow, vertical throat of dark limestone, where the wind did not merely blow, but shrieked with the fury of a wounded thing. Margaret Cole felt the vibration first, a low, visceral tremor that traveled through the massive hocks of Barnaby the Great and settled in the marrow of her own bones. It was a warning from the earth itself, a groan of tectonic fatigue that signaled the limits of the mountainside had been reached. She pulled back on the reins, and Barnaby, the great Shire horse who moved with the deliberate gravity of a moving hill, came to a halt. He did not dance or toss his head in the frantic, high-strung manner of the Thoroughbreds they had passed miles ago. He simply stood, his dinner-plate-sized hooves sinking an inch into the liquefying shale, his ears forward and alert to the shifting geometry of the slope. Then came the sound. It was a sharp, explosive series of reports, the cracking of the world's bones as the ancient roots of the pines above them finally surrendered to the weight of the sodden earth. Margaret watched, her breath held in a tight knot within her chest as the hillside 30 yards ahead simply detached itself. A cascade of black mud, jagged slate, and shattered timber tumbled across the path in a slow-motion convulsion of nature. The air was suddenly thick with the suffocating, bleeding scent of bruised resin and the sharp, metallic tang of pulverized stone. When the dust and mist settled, the path through the chimney was gone. In its place stood a jagged, smoking wall of forest debris, and rising sludge that looked like the fortifications of a primitive god. Any other horse, any of the elegant, thin-boned creatures that the Duke of Atherton so prized, would have bolted at the first rumble of that slide. They were animals built for the vanity of the sun, for the springy turf of the paddock and the cheering crowds of the grandstand. In this cauldron of sleet and sliding earth, such spirit was a liability, a flame that would have consumed itself in a panic-stricken plunge over the edge of the pass. But Barnaby did not possess the flight of a living flame. He possessed the constitution of the soil. He remained a stolid anchor in the chaos, his breathing heavy but rhythmic, his calm eye reflecting the grey chaos of the storm, without a flicker of terror. Margaret reached down and patted the wet, thick muscle of his neck, her fingers finding strength in the coarse hair. They were alone at the edge of the world, blocked by a graveyard of oak and stone, and the silence that followed the landslide was a heavy, accusing presence that seemed to have teeth. She began to calculate the scrupulous physics of the barrier, her mind working with the same precision she used to balance her father's meager ledgers. The path was buried, but the runoff from the high moors had started to pool against the debris, creating a treacherous, rising stream that spilled over the lip of the ravine. It was as she urged Barnaby forward to inspect the footing that a sound reached her, a fractured, high-pitched cry that did not belong to the wind or the mountain. It was a human sound, stripped of all pride and social armor, a desperate call for a salvation that the speaker clearly believed would never arrive. Margaret froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird in a cage. She knew that voice. It was a voice that had once rang out across the starting line with the cold clarity of a silver bell, mocking her horse as a mere stone that would sink in a race of fire. It was the voice of Arthur Atherton. She nudged Barnaby toward the edge of the rising water, the horse moving with a cautious, metronomic stability that ignored the biting sleet. In the churn of the muddy runoff below the limestone chimney, something caught a stray glint of the dying afternoon light. It was a flash of silver, a piece of polished vanity that looked utterly absurd in the midst of such primordial destruction. As she drew closer, she saw the gilded flask, engraved with the Atherton crest, bobbing hopelessly in a tangle of foam and dead reeds. It was a symbol of the Duke's world, expensive, ornamental, and entirely useless when the mountain decided to move. The flask was being swept toward the drop-off of the ravine, a discarded toy of the aristocracy. Margaret looked past the silver trinket, her eyes squinting against the stinging rain. There, 20 feet below the blocked path, she saw a shock of dark wool and a pale, mud-streaked hand reaching for the stability of a jagged rock that was rapidly being submerged by the freezing stream. The Duke's stallion, the living flame that had been the envy of the endurance trial, was nowhere to be seen. The animal had clearly fled in a blind terror, leaving its master to the mercy of the silt and the rising flood. Arthur Atherton was pinned, his lower half caught beneath a heavy, submerged limb of a fallen oak that the landslide had dragged into the water. He looked up, and for a fleeting Margaret gripped the reins of the reinforced rigging, the cold metal of the buckles biting into her palms. The Duke was sinking. The stream was rising with every pulse of the storm, and the weight of the timber holding him down was far beyond the strength of any human hand. She looked at Barnaby, then back at the man in the water, the enclosure papers, the debt on the farm, the 7 years of her father's labor. All of it hung in the balance of the next few minutes. She did not hesitate. She had come to the Blackwood moors to prove the worth of the soil, and as she began to unhook the long reinforced leather leads of her harness, she knew that the endurance of the plow was the only thing left that could possibly bridge the chasm between life and the cold, dark stone of the mountain. The devil's chimney was a gargoyle's throat, swallowing the sky and spitting it back as freezing sleet. Margaret moved with a clinical, focused speed, wading toward the churning white water of the creek bed where Arthur Atherton lay. He was pinned beneath a massive limb of a fallen oak, a jagged crown of timber that had been brought down by the shifting mud of the landslide. The water was rapidly pooling against his chest, the weight of the tree acting as a dam that would soon drown him in the very element that had claimed his pride, was rising rapidly, swirling around his waist in a cold, predatory embrace. To Margaret's left, the thoroughbred the Duke had boasted of, that creature of fire and lineage, was nowhere to be seen. It had bolted, its high-strung heart failing, when the earth began to move, leaving its master to the mercy of the mountain. The Duke's face was the color of wet parchment, his jaw set in a grimace that was as much a product of pride as it was of pain. He looked up as the massive shadow of the Plow horse fell over him, his grey eyes, the color of a sky that had forgotten how to clear, flickering with a complex mixture of relief and agonizing shame. He was a man who had worn his authority like a suit of armor for years, yet here he was, reduced to a broken figure in the mud, caught in the teeth of a world that did not care for his title. "Leave it," the Duke commanded, his voice hoarse and trembling with the onset of the cold, yet still carrying the ghost of a decree. "You cannot move this, Miss Cole. The wood is saturated. You will only drown the both of us if you attempt to linger. Save yourself and that beast of yours." Margaret did not answer. She did not even acknowledge the order. In the world of the moor and the plough, a command was only as good as the hand that could enforce it, and the Duke was currently powerless. She dismounted with a deliberate, unhurried grace, her stout boots sinking deep into the slurry of mud and ice. She observed the scene with the scrupulous eye of an auditor. The oak branch was thick, perhaps 300 pounds of waterlogged heartwood, and it was wedged into the soft bank in a way that created a natural vice. A lighter horse, a thoroughbred or a hunter, would have lacked the skeletal density to even stand in this current, let alone apply the steady, grounded force required to shift such a weight. She walked to Barnaby's head, placing a hand against the velvet of his nose. The horse did not flinch. He did not dance or roll his eyes in the frantic manner of the expensive animals they had passed miles ago. He stood like a boulder in a stream, his breath coming in slow, steaming plumes that smelled of oats and honest labor. In 7 years, the Duke had likely not seen a creature so constitutionally incapable of panic. Margaret began to work. Her fingers, though stiff with the cold, moved with the precision of a woman who understood the physics of survival. She reached for the sturdy draft gear, the practical, reinforced tackle she had chosen specifically for its durability. She unbuckled her own stirrup leathers, the thick, oiled hide groaning as she repurposed them into extra bindings, lashing the harness chains directly to a secure point on the fallen oak. Every movement was a testament to her competence, a quiet rebuttal to the laughter that had greeted them at the starting line. The Duke watched her, his breath hitching as a fresh surge of freezing water crested over the log. He saw her competence not as a gift, but as a judgment. He was the master of the estate, the owner of the very ground she stood upon, yet he was currently a debt that only she could settle. The silence between them had teeth biting deeper than the sleet. "I told you to go," he whispered, though the strength was fading from his words. "The bank is failing. If the horse slips, he will pull you both into the gorge." "Barnaby does not slip," Margaret said, her voice flat and iron-hard, devoid of the soft platitudes of the drawing-room. "He was bred for the heavy clay of the valley. He understands the weight of the earth better than you understand the weight of your own name. Your Grace, now, hold your breath if the wood shifts toward your chest. I will not have you crushing yourself through impatience." She stepped back to the horse's shoulder, her hand resting on the hames of the harness. She did not use a whip, she did not shout. Instead, she leaned in close to Barnaby's ear and spoke to him in the low, rhythmic farm tongue of her father, a language of clicks and guttural murmurs that was older than the Atherton lineage. It was a call to the blood, an invitation for the horse to find the bedrock beneath the mud. Barnaby shifted his weight, his massive hooves searching for purchase in the treacherous shale. He was not a creature of the sprint, he was a creature of the pull. He lowered his head, the muscles in his haunches bunching into knots of living granite. The thick iron chains began to sing, a high-pitched metallic tension that vibrated through the freezing air. For a moment, nothing moved. The oak held its ground, the stream roared its defiance, and the Duke closed his eyes as if preparing for the inevitable. Then the earth gave way, not in a landslide, but in a grudging, agonizing surrender. The sound was like a groan from the very lungs of the mountain. The massive oak branch began to slide, inches at first, then a foot, as the plough horse leaned his entire soul into the traces. Barnaby did not lunge, he simply became heavier than the obstacle. He was the personification of grit. The wood cleared his body with a final sucking splash, the current immediately trying to claim the space where the branch had been. Margaret moved instantly, wading into the waist-deep water to reach him. Her fingers locked into the sodden wool of his coat, her strength surprising them both. She was the payment for a debt he had never expected to owe, and as she began to drag him toward the stability of Barnaby's flank, the dusk finally began to settle over the Blackwood moors, a cold purple curtain falling on the world of silk and fire. The water at the base of the Devil's Chimney was no longer a mere element of nature. It had become an active, churning predator, tasting of bitter silt and the ancient rot of the mountain's roots. Arthur Atherton lay shivering as Margaret dragged him onto the relative safety of the bank, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that spoke of a chest compressed by the weight of his own miscalculation. Above him, the storm did not relitigate his status or his pedigree. It simply poured its frozen spite into the rising stream. Margaret did not offer him empty platitudes. She checked his pulse with a frightening, mechanical precision, her stout boots finding purchase in the shifting shale as she kept Barnaby positioned as a shield against the wind. Lowered, his calm, dark eyes fixed upon the woman, who was the only point of stillness in a world that was rapidly liquefying. She adjusted the heavy iron harness with hands that did not tremble, though they were blue with the biting cold. This was not a moment for speed, but for the unforgiving arithmetic of draft power. Margaret ensured the reinforced leather was seated flat against Barnaby's broad chest, the iron rings singing a low metallic note of protest as they bit into the damp padding. She was not attempting to lift the oak. That would be the vanity of a man who believed strength was a matter of ego. Instead, she calculated the geometry of a ploughman's extraction, focusing on the friction of the bark against the Duke's coat and the terrifying elasticity of the improvised straps she had fashioned from her own stirrup leathers. The Duke watched her through a haze of freezing sleet, his grey eyes, usually as cold and distant as a winter horizon, now reflecting a raw, animal terror that stripped away 7 years of aristocratic isolation. "Steady, my boy," Margaret murmured, her voice a low, vibrating chord that seemed to bypass the man entirely. It was a command meant for the beast and the stone, a sound rooted in the soil they both served. The horse leaned into the weight. It was not the sudden, frantic lunge of a thoroughbred, the kind of explosive, bone-breaking energy that would have snapped a lesser harness or driven the branch deeper into the Duke's flesh. Barnaby leaned with a relentless, metronomic gravity, as if he were back in the North Field turning a furrow of stubborn clay. His muscles bunched and rippled beneath his thick, mud-slicked coat, a living landscape of power that looked, for one breathless moment, like a statue carved from the very mountain itself. The heavy iron harness groaned under the strain, the iron links screaming against the wood, and then, with a sound like the earth itself exhaling a long-held breath, the oak branch began to shift. It dragged across the Duke's thighs, creating agonizing inches of space that the freezing water immediately sought to fill. Margaret watched the trajectory with a scrupulous, unwavering eye, her hand firm on Barnaby's bridle, guiding the massive animal with a touch, so light it seemed impossible given the tonnage involved. The horse did not tire. He did not falter. He simply existed as an immovable force, dragging the obstacle through the mire until the Duke was finally, mercifully clear of the oak's crushing embrace. The silence that followed the extraction was heavy, broken only by the roar of the wind and the rhythmic, unhurried breathing of the plough horse. Margaret did not wait for the Duke to find his voice, nor did she offer him a hand to help him rise from the muck. Instead, she dropped to her knees beside him, her fingers, chilled to the marrow but steady as a bookkeeper's ledger, moving over his soaked garments. She checked the angle of his limbs with a blunt, professional practicality that ignored the social chasm between them. Her touch was devoid of the soft hesitancy that social propriety demanded of a woman in the presence of a peer. She handled him with the same clinical detachment she would have shown a yearling with a strained hock. Arthur watched her, his senses returning in waves of sharp, icy clarity. He saw the way she didn't look at his face for a sign of rank, but at his pupils for a sign of concussion. He felt the heat radiating from Barnaby, a mountain of honest meat that had just done what 1,000 guineas could not. It had brought him back from the grave. "Your leg is not broken, though the bruising will be a ledger of your foolishness for a month to come." Margaret observed, her voice cutting through the sleet like a whetted blade. She reached into the mud near his hip and pulled out a mangled silver object, the gilded flask, its once fine engraving now scarred by the shale and the oak. She looked at the expensive trifle with a flicker of unmistakable disdain before pressing it into his numb hand. It was a cold, useless thing in a world that demanded the warmth of grit and the strength of iron. She leaned closer, her hand finding the pulse at his throat, her skin rough and calloused against his. In 7 years, the Duke was being seen not as a title, not as a mourning widower, but as a biological entity that required maintenance to remain solvent. The silence of the moor, it seemed, had teeth, and they had been clamped firmly around his throat until this plain, ink-stained woman had pried them loose. "You are constitutionally sound, sir," she said, her gaze meeting his with a directness that stripped away his frock coat and his lineage as surely as the storm had. "Though your judgment remains in a state of severe deficit. If you were one of my father's working beasts, I should have to consider the lead for you, as you've no sense of the terrain you claim to master. But as you are a man of the high house, I suppose we must settle for the walk." The Duke tried to speak, but his teeth chattered so violently that the words were lost to the wind. He looked from her steady, mud-streaked face to the massive, steaming flank of the plough horse that stood waiting. The animal was not beautiful by any standard of the London season. It was a creature of the clay and the heavy rain. Yet, as the purple light of dusk began to fail and the shadows of the towering limestone grew long and accusing, that stone was the only solid thing left in a world made of water. Margaret stood, her spine as straight as an iron rail, and offered him her hand, not in subservience but as a contract of survival. Arthur Atherton reached out and took it, his fingers closing around her calluses. And in that moment, the first crack appeared in the ice that had encased his heart for 7 long years. The light was dying, bleeding out in bruised purples and suffocating greys over the jagged, unforgiving spine of the Blackwood moors. Arthur Atherton leaned heavily against the broad, warm flank of Barnaby the Great, his fine leather boots. Once the envy of every gentleman in the county, now lost beneath 6 inches of freezing shale and slurry. Every movement was a calculation of pain, his ribs protesting the heavy, rhythmic jarring of each step. Yet he found himself clinging to the horse, as if it were the only solid land in a world turned to liquid. Beside him, the great beast moved with a terrifying, metronomic stability, its massive hooves finding purchase in the mud with the certainty of a mountain. Arthur, whose life had been a scrupulous study of equine lineage and the delicate, almost lyrical mechanics of the gallop, reached out a trembling hand. He laid his palm against the horse's neck, beneath the thick, coarse mane that smelled of rain and honest earth. He was searching for the telltale lather of a spent animal, the frantic, visible thrum of a heart pushed beyond its constitution. He expected to find the horse shivering, its spirit broken by the weight of the extraction and the miles of vertical climbing through the sleet. Instead, he found only heat. There was no sweat, no frantic tremble of the muscle, and no foam at the mouth. Barnaby's heart beat against the Duke's hand with the slow, tectonic rhythm of the earth itself, deliberate, massive, and entirely unbothered by the storm. He is not even winded," Arthur managed to whisper, the words catching in his throat like dry husks. It was a shattering of every principle he held dear, a catastrophic failure of his own judgment. He had spent £10,000 on bloodlines that promised speed and elegance. Yet here was a creature of the plough. A stone he had mocked at the starting line, carrying the physical weight of a man and the crushing memory of a disaster without a single falter in its step. The Duke felt a sudden, sharp pang of indignity, not at the horse but at the reflection of himself. He had lived his life believing that pedigree was the only safety worth the name. Yet here he was, saved by a beast whose only pedigree was a lineage of labor. Margaret Cole did not turn her head to acknowledge his realization. Her spine remained a straight, iron line against the darkening sky, her fingers encased in the damp, salt-stained leather of the reins. She looked less like a rider and more like a part of the landscape, a figure carved from the very granite that sought to break them. "Speed is a luxury of the sun, Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying across the wind with a clarity that stung. "Speed is for the afternoon, when the paths are dry and the spectators are watching. Barnaby was not bred for the afternoon. He was bred for the dusk, for the years when the rain does not stop and the land demands its due in sweat. They passed the abandoned remains of the elite field as they descended toward the lower moors. In a hollow shielded by a cluster of gorse, a chestnut mare, a creature of silk and fire worth a king's ransom, lay shivering in the mud. Her rider was nowhere to be seen, likely huddled in some crevice of the jagged rocks. But the animal was clearly ghosting, its eyes rolled back in a lethargy born of cold, and a heart too fine for such heavy footing. The sight was an unforgiving mirror for the Duke. His world, the London ballrooms, the manicured racing tracks, the pedigrees that went back to the Crusades, was a world of silk. It was beautiful, shimmering, and utterly useless when the weather turned to iron. Arthur reached for the silver flask at his hip, the gilded Atherton crest catching a stray, dying glint of the moon. It was empty, the glass within shattered during the fall, and the precious brandy had long ago seeped into the insatiable mud. He looked at the flask, then at the heavy iron harness that Margaret had used to save him. The iron was ugly, pocked with the scars of work, and built for the grim utility of the field, yet it had not buckled. It had held the weight of a fallen oak, while his own pride had fled into the dark. The silence between them, it seemed, had teeth, gnawing at the remnants of his arrogance until there was nothing left but the raw, honest cold. "I have built a mausoleum of beauty," the Duke said softly, his voice low enough that only the wind and the woman before him could hear. "I looked at the world and saw only what was pleasing to the eye. I saw your horse as a blemish on my moors. I saw your father's land as a ledger to be balanced, a series of numbers that lacked the grace of my stallion's stride." He paused, leaning his forehead against Barnaby's shoulder for a fleeting moment, drawing strength from the horse's unwavering heat. "But you built a world that can survive the storm. You built a world out of grit and honest iron while I was busy polishing the silver." Margaret finally stopped, the movement so sudden and controlled that the Duke nearly stumbled. She turned to look at him, her grey eyes reflecting the cold steel of the evening sky. There was no triumph in her expression, only a scrupulous, measuring exhaustion. "Numbers do not lie, sir," she replied, her words an echo of the ledgers she kept by candlelight in the draughty farmhouse. "People lie about them. They lie about what a horse is worth, and they lie about what a man is worth. But the mud is always honest. It does not care for your title, and it does not care for my poverty. It only asks who can stand when the light fails." The Duke of Atherton looked at the woman who had become his savior, and finally, after 7 years, the grief that had worn him like a heavy coat seemed to thin. He saw the ink-stained fingers clutching the reins, the mud-splattered wool of her cloak, and the unwavering integrity of her gaze. She was the only safety he had ever truly known. As they began the final, agonizing walk toward the distant, flickering lights of the lodge, Arthur did not ask to be carried. He kept his hand on the plough horse's neck and walked beside her stirrup, a man finally learning the weight of the earth he owned. The final 5 miles of the Blackwood moors were no longer a landscape, but a void, a charcoal smudge where the sky and the earth had conspired to erase every landmark. In this ink-black theatre, the only reality was the rhythmic, metronomic strike of Barnaby's hooves against the freezing shale. It was a sound that possessed a certain gravity, a heavy and honest percussion that seemed to anchor the world from drifting away into the abyss of the sleet. Margaret Cole sat atop the massive beast, her body long since past the point of mere exhaustion. She had entered a state of crystalline clarity, where the pain was simply a ledger entry, noted and then dismissed. The heavy iron harness, reinforced and stubborn, creaked with every colossal stride of the horse, a comforting groan of metal against leather that spoke of survival. Beside her stirrup, Arthur Atherton walked with a gait that was far from the polished stride he usually brought to the drawing rooms of the Tun. The Duke was a man composed of mud and shadow, his expensive riding coat soaked through and heavy as a suit of mail. He leaned occasionally against Barnaby's broad, warm flank, drawing heat from the living mountain of meat that he had once mocked as a mere stone. There was a profound silence between them, the kind of stillness that exists only between two souls who have looked into the mouth of a storm and refused to blink. Margaret could feel his gaze on her, a grey and piercing interrogation even in the gloom, but she did not turn her head. She had ceased to be a tenant farmer's daughter, or a debtor's child. She was merely the pilot of this great slow-moving vessel of bone and muscle. In an act of total, terrifying surrender, Margaret felt her fingers go slack. She did not tighten the reins or attempt to steer the animal through the labyrinth of the rising water and the shifting mud. Instead, she dropped the leather straps entirely, letting them lie across the horse's thick, steam-rising neck. It was an admission of faith that few riders of the elite class would ever understand. The recognition that the beast beneath her possessed a wisdom of the soil that no pedigree could replicate. Barnaby did not falter. He lowered his massive head, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the air for the scent of the road, and continued his relentless march. Arthur watched the gesture, his breath hitching in the cold air as he realized what she had done. To trust a plough horse with one's life in the heart of a mountain storm was an act of madness to a man of the London season, yet here it was the only safety worth the name. The darkness intensified, the sleet turning into a needle-sharp rain that threatened to flay the skin from their faces. Every muscle in the horse's hind quarters bunched and shifted with the power of a piston, his thick legs navigating the treacherous shale with a delicacy that was almost poetic. They were moving through the graveyard of the elite. Somewhere in the blackness lay the shivering remains of thoroughbreds that had been bred for the sun and the flat grass, now broken by the constitution of the moors. Margaret could hear the Duke's breathing, jagged and labored, and she felt a sudden, sharp pang of something that was not quite pity, but a recognition of a shared mortality. For 7 years, this man had worn his grief like a shroud, building walls of breeding and rank to keep the world away. Now, those walls had been washed away by the mud, leaving only the grit of the man who remained. As they rounded a jagged outcrop of granite, a low, wretched moan drifted through the sound of the rain. Barnaby paused without being asked, his ears swiveling toward a shallow alcove beneath the rock. There, huddled in a pathetic heap of damp wool and shattered vanity, was Silas Thorne. The man who had served the enclosure papers with such clinical delight was now a shivering spectre, his horse long since bolted or collapsed. His teeth chattered with a sound like breaking glass, and his eyes, wide and hollow with the fear of the dark, fixed upon Margaret as if she were a ghost. He looked nothing like the gatekeeper of social propriety. He looked like a child lost in a forest he did not respect. Margaret did not speak a word of reproach, for the silence of the moors had already said enough. She reached into her coat and pulled out a simple skin of water, leaning down to offer it to the man who had sought to destroy her home. It was a gesture of superior constitution, an act of mercy that was as sturdy and unsentimental as the horse she rode. She did not offer him a seat on the horse. There was no room for vanity here, but she gave him the means to endure. Beside her, Arthur watched the exchange, his expression unreadable beneath the mask of grime. He saw the way Margaret treated her enemy with the same honest dignity she accorded her livestock, and in that moment, the architecture of his world shifted irrevocably. Silas Thorne took the water with trembling hands, his gaze flicking toward the Duke as if seeking a familiar hierarchy to cling to, but he found none. Arthur Atherton was not looking at the sycophant. He was looking at the woman who had mastered the storm. The Duke realized then that the enclosure papers, those crisp and cold documents currently residing in his study, were a lie. They were a lie about who owned the land and who was fit to walk upon it. He looked at the massive mud-caked plough horse that refused to tire, and then at the woman whose spine remained straight despite the weight of the sky. The land, he understood with a clarity that cut through his 7 years of grief, did not belong to the titles. It belonged to the grit of the plough. They left Thorne there in the relative safety of the alcove, Margaret having pointed out the direction of the rescue path with a blunt, ink-stained finger. The final miles were a slow, agonizing crawl toward the distant, flickering lights of the lodge, but the tension had changed. It was no longer the tension of survival, but the quiet, humming anticipation of a truth about to be revealed. The Duke walked closer to her now, his hand resting almost unconsciously on her stirrup, as if he needed the contact to remind him that he was still anchored to the earth. The purple light of dusk began to seep through the clouds, a bruised and beautiful glow that signaled the end of the trial. Margaret Cole remained mounted, her silhouette carved from iron and will, leading the man who had laughed at her back toward a world that would never look at either of them the same way again. In the distance, the lodge was holding its breath, unaware that the only rider still mounted was coming home on a horse made of stone and soul. The purple dusk did not arrive as a gentle curtain, but as a heavy, bruising weight that pressed the last of the light into the sodden earth of the Atherton estate. At the edge of the great stone courtyard, the lanterns of the hunting lodge flickered like dying stars against the relentless onslaught of the sleet. A crowd had gathered under the shelter of the portico, a shivering collection of grooms, officials, and the elite riders who had surrendered to the Moors hours ago. They were waiting for a ghost, or perhaps for a tragedy. The Thoroughbreds, those creatures of silk and fire, stood in the stables behind them, their lungs heaving and their spirits broken by a terrain that cared nothing for their pedigree. The silence that held the courtyard was absolute, a thing with teeth that gnawed at the nerves of those waiting. It was broken suddenly, not by a shout or a cheer, but by a sound that was rhythmic, heavy, and unmistakably grounded in the reality of the soil. It was the metronomic clack of iron on stone. Out of the swirling grey mist and the deepening shadows, a shape emerged that defied the expectations of every aristocratic eye present. It was not a slender racer or a nimble hunter. It was a mountain of honest meat and matted fur, a creature of thick bone and an unwavering eye. Barnaby the Great moved with a slow, relentless dignity, his massive hooves striking the cobbles with the finality of a judge's gavel. And there, seated upon the wide, steaming back of the Plow horse, was Margaret Cole. Her spine was as straight as a ledger line, her face a mask of exhaustion and iron-hard integrity. She was the only rider still mounted. Beside her stirrup, his hand resting on the sturdy working tackle for support, walked Arthur Atherton. The Duke, the nobleman, who had worn his pride like a shield for 7 years, was unrecognizable. He was covered in the black, mineral-rich mud of the gorge, his expensive riding habit torn, his jaw set in a grimace of hard-won humility. He did not look like a master returning to his domain. He looked like a man who had been pulled back from the edge of a grave by the very thing he had mocked. Silas Thorne stepped forward, his face pale and his eyes darting toward the Duke in a frantic search for the old status quo. But Arthur did not look at him. The Duke's grey eyes, usually as cool as a sky that has not decided whether to clear, were fixed upon the woman beside him. Peter Cole broke from the shadows of the stables, his breath hitching as he saw his daughter. He did not reach for her first. He reached for Barnaby, laying a weathered hand on the horse's steaming neck. The beast did not flinch. He simply breathed, a great, warm cloud of life that defied the freezing dark. Margaret looked down at her father, and in that silent exchange, the weight of the debt seemed to shift, becoming a thing that could finally be carried. The great hall of the lodge was a cavern of mahogany and flickering candlelight, a space that usually demanded a certain scrupulous propriety. Tonight, however, it smelled of wet wool, iron-rich mud, and the sharp, clean scent of rain. Arthur Atherton stood by the massive hearth, the heat of the fire beginning to steam the moisture from his clothes. He looked down at the table where the enclosure papers lay. Those crisp, cold legal documents that had threatened to erase the history of the Cole family from the land. Beside them sat the gilded flask he had carried into the storm, now dented and empty, a useless trinket of a world that had failed him when the earth turned to liquid. Margaret stood across from him, her ink-stained fingers resting on the edge of the table. She did not ask for mercy, she did not need to. Her competence was the only currency that mattered now, a solvency of the soul that the Duke could no longer ignore. Arthur picked up the papers. He looked at the ink, the signatures, the cold arithmetic of displacement. Then, without a word, he leaned forward and cast the documents into the heart of the fire. The flames leaped up, hungrily consuming the parchment, turning the threat into nothing more than grey ash that danced up the chimney. The land belongs to the grit of the plough. Margaret, the Duke said, his voice hoarse but steady. I have spent my life obsessing over the purity of lineages, believing that a name or a breed could insulate a man from the truth of the world. I was a fool. A pedigree is a fragile thing in a storm. Integrity, it seems, is found in the bone and the breath of those who refuse to stop when the light fails. He looked at her then, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as a tenant's daughter, but as his intellectual parity, the woman whose steady heart had matched the relentless pace of her horse. The silence in the lodge was no longer a thing that gnawed, it was a sanctuary. The house, which had been holding its breath for 7 years, seemed to exhale a long, warm sigh as the heat of the fire reached the furthest corners of the room. Outside, in the stable yard, the Duke had insisted on a final act of submission. He had taken the grooming brush from a confused stable boy and approached Barnaby. Under the watchful, tired eyes of Margaret and her father, the most powerful man in the county began to scrupulously brush the dried mud from the plough horse's thick legs. It was a gesture of recognition, a silent vow that the old world of vanity had ended, and for a singular moment in a generation, it was a page they would write together, with fingers that were no longer afraid of the ink or the soil. True worth is not a thing that can be measured by a title or the speed of a thoroughbred over a flat track. It is the endurance of a steady heart when the terrain is brutal and the night is closing in. As the fire in the lodge burned low, Margaret knew that her home was safe, not because of a miracle, but because she had stayed mounted when everyone else had fallen. The future was a clean page, and for the first time in a generation it was a page they would write together, with fingers that were no longer afraid of the ink or the soil. Have you ever felt invisible, only to have the right person finally see the true strength of your character? Where are you listening from tonight as the fireside glows? May your home be as secure as a ledger in balance, and may you find the grit to remain mounted until the dusk is won. Good night from the fireside.